Hi, everybody. I'm BJ from the Maine State Library, and today I'm going to do part 2 of a talk on tracing female ancestors. I actually got through more on Monday than I expected, so there's not really a PowerPoint today. I'm going to talk a little about dower versus dowry so you really get the difference. And then I'm going to show you some examples of records I've used over the years that get me closer, if not actually knowing a woman's maiden name. So first, let me talk very briefly about the difference between the dower right and the dowry. And this comes down in a lot of cases to the difference between areas that work under English common law and those that deal with being more out of the continental Europe French civil law. So this is one of those things that Maine, as part of Massachusetts, would have been part of the sphere of influence of English common law, whereas Quebec would have, and Louisiana and the Spanish colonies worked under European civil law as a model. And the two looked at marriage very differently in terms of the legal side when dealing with money and property. So in English common law, as I said on Monday, when a couple got married, until you started getting Married Women's Property Acts passed in the middle of the 19th century, anything a woman owned became the property of her husband. If she inherited money after their marriage, the husband controlled it. But out of that came the idea that when a husband died, the widow automatically got a portion of his estate, generally a third, that was either a life interest, meaning as long as she lived, or until she remarried, depending on how the will was written. And then when she died, if it was a life interest, it passed to the children. If a man sold, say, his farm, a woman would have to sign off on selling her dower right in that. And so you get cases where a husband is selling property that he inherited from his wife's side of the family, and that can help you work back to what her maiden name was, because you can look and see who owned the land before him, and if it was somebody who could have potentially been a relative of the wife. In civil law countries, legally marriage was a contract, and the contract spelled out what the wife brought to the marriage, her dowry, and the extent to which she would continue to control it both during the marriage and after. And so there are contracts, and so in Quebec, those are often in the notary public's records. And so those can be hard to track down because they're generally filed by the name of the notary. And if you don't know who the notary was, it's hard to find it. And very few of those are indexed these days. But it is worth, if you have Quebecois or Spanish colonial ancestors, seeing if you can track those down, because if you can, there's often a lot of information about who her family was, because she's bringing often property, particularly a family that owned land, she's bringing land that she is being given often in place of an inheritance from her father later on. In many cases, a woman's pretty much getting her inheritance as her dowry in that kind of system. So that's something to be aware of, that there's that difference with the French and Spanish law, and the colonies that were working under that law had that very different look at how marriage worked in terms of property. Does that make sense to everybody? The difference between a dower right and a dowry? Because it's one of those that I've had people assume they're the same thing, and they're not. And you rarely get both a dowry and a dower right. They're two different ways of dealing with the same situation of how is a widow supported after her husband dies in a culture where women don't have jobs. So that is the difference there and what you should be looking for. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is show you some sample records that show some ways that you can, other than a straight marriage record, although one of these actually is a marriage record, but I'm going to show you a quirk about it, that will, I hope, stimulate some ideas for you of ways that you can look at records more carefully and in more detail to see what the sort of, it's the whole, that fan club, friend, family, associates, neighbors, and looking at a person's life. And in the case, particularly in the English colonies, where you have this system where the wife's legal identity is folded into the husband's, you're going to be looking at records for the husband and analyzing them. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is share my screen. And this is a will from 1699. Are you guys seeing the will? Okay. From a Zebulon Hill. And he lives in Salem, Massachusetts. He's a cooper, so he has tools rather than a farm, because he's making barrels and storage containers, which, in a seaport like Salem was beginning to be at this time, a cooper was often, he was a skilled craftsman. Making barrels was a very skilled occupation. So what's interesting here is that he talks about, various things he owns. And what's interesting is, let me go up to the top of the next page. And he says, let me make this bigger so you can see it, that he's giving a lot of this to Philip Hill, to him and his heirs forever. And then he should pay unto my loving daughters, Elizabeth Marston, Abigail Allen, and Sarah Morgan. So this tells you that he's got 3 daughters, they're all married, and gives you their married names. And what's interesting, he says to each of them 4 pounds, and to my grandchildren, Benjamin Ashby and Elizabeth Ashby. And so from this, you can guess there's a really good chance he actually had a 4th daughter who married an Ashby and has died before he did. And so this is a case where looking at this will can confirm that the Abigail Hill that married an Allen, a Benjamin Allen in this case, is the one who's the daughter of Zebulun and not the daughter of his brother John, who was also named Abigail. And so that's a way where you can confirm a good choice of a married name. The frustration with this is when this is indexed, none of these names are indexed. So you sometimes have to play, let's go with this the wrong way and look at what we speculate who the father might have been and work from that rather than the more usual working from the daughter that you know back to the father. But this is something that does work because in many cases, if a man lived to middle age or older, his daughters were married by the time he made his will. The other thing to look at, and it does not happen to be the case with this one, well, actually, before I go that, here's his wife signing off on this. With her mark. So she's not signing it, she's making her mark. And you'll see that different people did indeed have different marks they made. Hers is basically an A. And then here is the inventory of his estate. And basically this is saying, here's what I owned that's worth something. So you can see the Cooper shop is worth 75 pounds. And everything else pretty much, with just a couple exceptions, is only measured in shillings and pence. So 75 of the 87 pounds on this page is his shop. The reason to look at this is he doesn't happen to have this, but I have several times found in an inventory list that he owed somebody, a man owed somebody money, or somebody owed him money, and it's often his wife's brother. It's not unusual. This one doesn't have it, but it's not unusual to have one of the people who's the executor, especially if there's a fairly large estate, be the wife's brother or father, depending on who's alive, to look out for her interests. You know, especially, and I have found that especially true when she's young enough to remarry and have more children. So that's a look at one way wills can help you. This is a later will. Let me, here it is. And you'll see that by the late 1800s, they've got a pre-printed form. This is a fascinating one. She is filing for probate as the widow of this man, and she says she lives in Wenham, Massachusetts. She'd actually lived in Chicago with a daughter for at least 15 years before this. So they never officially divorced, but I think there was an informal separation. But she still is the one petitioning the probate court. And this is nice. It lists everybody all their children, and again, women by their married name. So here's the daughter she was living with in Chicago, Kate Starrett. And then children of her deceased daughter. So again, it's linking, in this case, 3 generations, because you've got Henry the father, you've got the deceased daughter Henrietta, and then the list of her children who were alive at the time that Henry died. Says she's the widow. And again, you get the daughters signing that they know what's going on with the will. Does that make sense why they had to sign to say, you know, we acknowledge this and we're supporting our mother's petition? So here's one that's less helpful. This is in Wisconsin. And we've got William Waterman, tells where he's from. He was the son of Lucius Waterman, and lists his widow, Rachel, which, at least if you didn't have a first name, gives it to you, and 6 children. John, James, and then has Harriet with a blank, wife of blank, by a former wife. So Lucius and his first wife, Harriet, had divorced. She'd stayed in Massachusetts with these 3 children. Lucius had married a woman named Rachel and moved out to Wisconsin. And again, you get William, the petitioner, Garrett, another son, and Anna, wife of, I think that's Calvin Searle, if I remember correctly. And it tells where they are living. But this is nice because it divides out which kids go with which marriage. Which, if you didn't have that information, can be very helpful. You know, in this case, it's easy to distinguish because one family's in Massachusetts and one's in Wisconsin. But I've had cases where, you know, they're right in the same town and there's no record of the second marriage. So having this type of will to pull out children from the first marriage versus children from the second marriage can be quite helpful. So let's now, this is a naturalization done in 1900. Again, you can see that they've gone to a pre-printed form, which on one hand means you get less chance of a clerk adding extra information spontaneously, but on the other hand, they're more likely to make sure they've got the information that you want. And so this is an interesting case. So you have Isidore, and he mentions he's got his wife's name. You can tell looking at the children, the first 2 were born in Russia, and then the rest in New York, and there's a 5-year gap in between. And so what's interesting, so this can tell you that they were probably married in Russia, unless Regina is a second wife and these kids are from a first wife. You don't want to make too much of an assumption, but on the other hand, if you're interested in Regina, no, it doesn't give her maiden name, but it gives her birth date and place, which can be a way of backtracking further. I have found there's a slight tendency towards, if they immigrated together, to not give her maiden name, but if they immigrated separately and met in the US, to give her maiden name because it's on the passenger list that way. As I said, that's anecdata, not straight, this is the way it was, but that's been my somewhat educated experience, that you get people who have come separately, giving the wife's maiden name. But this is interesting because the kids were born in Russia, but she was born in Hungary. So I have real questions about how they met. I need to go further into looking at where these places were. But having just the birth date and place in Europe can be a really helpful bit of information if you don't already have that. And here we're going to look, this is actually a marriage record. And the Quakers very nicely, in almost all of their marriage records, start out with the groom's name, where he's from, his father's name, where the father's from, the occupations for both the groom and the father, mother's name, and then you have the same for the bride. So you've got some information here, but when I went to look at this woman is named Rachel Holmes, the bride, and she's a daughter of a Thomas Holmes, and Rachel, his wife. Well, I found, needless to say, I found more than one Rachel Holmes with a father, Thomas Holmes. And so to help me narrow down which one this was, let me stop sharing. Actually, let me show you this. So, the husband and wife sign, and then in a Quaker marriage, everybody who attends the marriage signs the certificate. Can you see where this can be a genealogical gold mine? It gets even better. Traditionally, this column on the right is close family and friend, close family of the bride and groom, which I'm going to have to stop sharing for a minute and then share again. Here we go. So are you seeing a blow up of that right-hand column on the shared screen? Okay. So what I did on this is I copied just that column, and on one side I put the husband, and on the other the wife. And so I went through and figured out, well, Eleanor Leroy, and this should be Nehemiah Leroy, obviously are on the husband's side of the family. The Holmeses are her side of the family. And I was able, through looking at records, to figure out that John, Joseph, Benjamin, and Abraham were her brothers. William Soden and Wilfred Sherrow were married to Rachel's sisters. And so here's Anne Soden, the sister. We go back to the sisters of the groom. Here's John's wife. Here's Joseph's wife. And here's the one that really helped me pin down exactly which family it was. This woman is actually the bride's aunt by marriage. Isabella's first husband was Abraham Miller, who was the brother of Abraham Milner, who was the brother of Rachel Milner, who was Rachel Holmes's mother. And so this gives me enough information that even if I never find a birth record for Rachel Holmes that connects her to her parents, I can say confidently that she belongs in this family with this Rachel Milner Holmes and this Thomas Holmes and these brothers. Does that make sense to everybody? Isn't that, yeah, if you ever run into Quaker ancestors, they kept really good records. It's really nice. So let me see. Where did the chat box come up? Okay. So any questions at this point? But I chose these to show you as a way of showing how you really do sometimes want to analyze the documents, because there may be more information in them than you're seeing at a first read. With Zebulon Hill's will, it would be really easy to not pay attention to those Ashby grandchildren in order to say, hey, maybe there's another daughter that's already died. Here, able to confirm which family Rachel belongs to, and with that Waterman will, confirming which children belong to which marriage, and that for example, that William Waterman was not a child he'd taken from the first marriage with him when he left. Okay, so let me go back to sharing. So any questions? Yeah, that right-hand column on the Quaker marriage record is almost always, let me share the screen again. This right-hand column is almost always where close family signed. And there are some other people over here that are, like this Michael Lister is actually one of Isabella, her first husband, so he's a cousin, and various other things like that. But this is where the close family will have signed. So let's take a look at some Scottish records, just for you to see how different records can have different things. So this is interesting. So we read along, and we've got, Hamilton. They very nicely have the surname in a it's not an index, but at least it's a finding aid. John Hamilton, private in the Lanarkshire Militia, and Christian Ramsey, and then SP stands for spouse. ALN, a lawful, ALS, a lawful son William, born, and then gives the information, including baptized soon after. I would guess William probably, they thought he was going to die, and they baptized him. Here you have, Richard, can't quite read that last name, in Mole, which was a farm name, and Elizabeth Ingalls, his wife, a daughter named, okay, so a daughter named, so this is actually ASN, so a son named, a daughter named, but it's saying specifically his spouse. But if we look at this one, George Brown, tenant in Skirling Mill, so he's a small farmer on Skirling Mill, at Skirling Mill, and Janet Clark in this peerage had a natural daughter named, well, natural daughter and the lack of calling Janet Clark his spouse mean that this child was born to unwed parents who weren't married. And so sometimes what you want to do is you want to read the whole page, because this clues where if you weren't sure what natural daughter meant, you'd want to figure that out. This tells you you're not going to find a marriage record for these two up until April 1807. But looking and seeing, does your ancestor's entry fit the pattern of all the others on the page. And if it doesn't, what's different and why. Now, this is a case where, you know, this probably, if the Kirk session minutes survive, there is probably a case, this is early enough that the elders of the local Presbyterian church, which was the established church in Scotland, would have basically done what we call opening a file on this baby. And the reason the father is mentioned is that they want to make sure that they can charge him for any support of this child, rather than the parish having to pay for it. Does that make sense? Why they're going to go after figuring out who the father is? Even in the Catholic records in Scotland, you get Helen, lawful daughter of Michael Cassidy and Mary Goodman. Now, this doesn't specifically say that they're married, but by saying lawful daughter, it tells you that they are indeed married, even though she's listed by her maiden name. And here's the reason I chose to show you this one. John, son of John McLaherty, supposed father, and Anne McCall. So I'm guessing in this case, he has not admitted paternity, but she's accused him of being the father. So I just figured you guys would be interested in that. But again, if at this time in Scotland, the son John could have used either or both surnames at different points in his life. The other thing to take a look at on these is the sponsors. So for Helen, it's Edward Blaney and Margaret McGrath. And I can tell you that Edward Blaney actually ends up being a witness to the baptism of some of Helen's children when she's an adult and gets married, which tells me there is some relationship between either Michael Cassidy or Mary Goodman and Edward Blaney, because he's witnessing baptisms for the same family 25 years apart, which tells me they're not just pulling him off the street to be a witness. He isn't the one who just happens to be at Mass every day, and so he happens to be the witness when they baptize the child. And so it would be worth tracking down these two witnesses. And it's not unusual for one of the witnesses, both at a child's baptism and at a marriage. Again, one of them is often from the bride's or mother's side of the family as a way of safeguarding her rights. Does that make sense to everybody? Why you should, and again, these witnesses are not indexed. You know, this is why you want to go and look at the original record and not just the index, because you get the witnesses, you get things like, when this is indexed, they probably don't put supposed father. They probably don't put illegitimate child. You only find that out by looking at the record. But yeah, this one with the supposed father would send me towards looking to see if there is, either in the Catholic records or the civil poor law records, any indication of whether, of how they found out from the mother and what evidence there was. Did he end up paying support, or did she end up getting parish support from the parish? And sometimes those records will still exist, and they'll talk about, you know, her parents are deceased, you know, the mother's parents are deceased, or her father's deceased, and her mother is supporting 6 other children, so can't support this grandchild, or father is disabled and mother is deceased, things like that. Where did the chat window go? So I see we've got, so why is the chat window not coming up? There it is. That's not it. Okay, so let's look at a couple more of these and then I'll get back to whatever question there was. Here's another one where you get, this is interesting. This, because it's not a form, this particular minister tells you for each couple, William McDougall Weaver, Ladywell is the residence, and Margaret Scott had their first child named this. These two, William Scott and Helen Hunter, had their fifth born child, and so on. So this was this minister gave us this nice little extra bit about which number child it was. Again, that won't be in the index. But the thing I did want you to see is they're pretty consistently giving the wife by the maiden name, because women in Scotland were still, Scottish law wasn't quite as restrictive as English law on the wife being folded into the husband's identity. It was still mostly based on English common law, but Scotland does have different laws than England. Here's one. This is a death record. This is one that you'll want to show you where you get relict of, in this case, it does have her name. I've seen this often where it would actually say Marie or widow, and then relict of William Patterson, and not give you the wife's name. Fortunately, in this one, they do. So that's one of the things, if you're not finding, and different sites handle widow differently in that context. Some put widow in as the first name, and some leave the first name blank. And so you'll want to try both. Is that clear how that can be a complication? Here's one. Why did I pull this one up? Again, looking at the sponsors on the baptisms can be very helpful. And I don't remember which one of these was the reason I pulled this one up. The caffeine hasn't quite penetrated my brain. Oh, I think it was this one down here. No, yeah. So that's just, the sponsors are really helpful. And here's another one where they very nicely give you the father's name in really big letters, repeat that his spouse, tell you where they lived, and the witnesses or sponsors. So let me stop sharing the screen. Okay, lawful child means that the child was born when the parents were married. A natural child is an illegitimate child. Other phrases I've seen are base born, born in uncleanliness, Natural child is actually a bit of a euphemism there. And it's worth, if a child is born out of wedlock or is born less than 8 months after the marriage, in both Scotland and New England, it's worth looking at the church records to see if there's a case of the minister or the elders of the congregation looking into it. In New England, it was a civil issue, and you'll be surprised how many couples in the 1600s into the 1700s get pulled before the local court for fornication when the child is born either out of wedlock or less than 7 months or less after the marriage. So yeah, in the Scottish records, lawful means the parents were married. And so they may say a lawful child, they may say, not say that, but say, and his spouse. But they'll generally indicate in some way that the parents were married. Or conversely, I've seen cases where they don't say anything about that, but they very clearly make it obvious which children were born when the parents weren't married. Kathy, does that make sense? Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing the screen. Okay, so do those examples show you a bit more about, there's no magic trick to finding female ancestors. It's the same thing you're doing for your male ancestors, but realizing the legal issues that make it harder in some cases. And the social issues, like those newspaper accounts of the anniversary party where you just have the husband named. That's just, that's societal, not legal at that point. But that's the sort of thing that I wanted you to see how, like in the will, you can sometimes get something that, there's no specific, in Zebulon Hill's will, one of my daughters married somebody named Ashby. But it's worth looking for a Hill married to an Ashby in that time frame to see if you can find that family, if you're looking at that family, at Zebulon Hill's family. He doesn't name that daughter. And so I have cases in my database where, I know the daughter had kids from the will. There's no surviving marriage record for the daughter, and the children's baptismal records only list their father's name. And so I have unnamed daughter, married so-and-so, because I don't have any clue to what her name actually is, because I don't have a record of it. Okay, when you have a will that just lists the spouse and not their children who are dealt with this, is that common? Not in the colonial era, but yet you do get, particularly once you get into the middle of the 19th century and later, it's not at all unusual for a will to just say, I leave everything to my wife. Generally before about 1830 to 1850, depending on when and where and how the law has changed, you're going to get adult children mentioned, even if it's only to say I've already given them their inheritance. because that is something that some fathers did, especially with daughters. One interesting thing, people always laugh because William Shakespeare's will gives the second best bed to his wife when he dies. And people, again, I've talked to you a lot of times about having some context, and people go, oh, that's mean, he only gave her the second best bed. Well, the best bed would have been the one for the guests, and the second best bed was the one they used. But you'll notice he had to, the bed that they had used together, he had to specifically state that she got it, and it didn't go to one of the kids. And that, I think that really clarifies to me the extent to which you do have the wife's identity folded into the husband's legally. That, she didn't even technically own the bed they were living in, they used. But yeah, it's in the 1830s to 50s, you start getting, in English-speaking areas, you start, I think it's 1834 or 37 in the UK that you get, I know it's in the 1830s, you get the Married Women's Property Act that changes some of this so a married woman can keep her inheritance and other things like that. So by 1883, you're getting women who own things, either they've bought themselves, they've inherited, and they're leaving it to the spouse. Adoption. Adoption is one of those things that is very quirky, depending on when and where you're working. For example, I talk about my great-grandfather being adopted. He was born in 1861. He was placed with the Jameson family in 1863, but he was never legally adopted because legally adoption did not exist in Scotland until 1931. So it's really hard to say without looking at a specific situation. Almost certainly I can say in English-speaking countries before 1900, you rarely get an adoption the way we think of them, where the child is given a new birth certificate with the new name so that it looks like the parents had the child. You get lots of informal adoptions. You get guardianships. Colonial New England guardianship records are part of the probate court, and if a man died, even if his wife was still alive, there was often a guardian appointed for the children to look out for their interests, especially if the mother remarried, to make sure that the children weren't cut out of their inheritance and such. And that's another way I've found mothers' names is through those guardianship records. But there's no one-size-fits-all answer with adoption. So if you have, Mary or anyone else, if you have a specific question on an adoption, let's look at it and see what we can figure out from it, because it really, that's one where it varies so much by time and place. I can make fairly broad statements about a wife inheriting and her dower right, because the details changed about whether it was more customary to be a life interest or only until she remarried and things like that. But the adoption is too quirky to make a generalized statement. Any other questions? Okay, anyone have any really good stories about how they found a female ancestor that they want to share? Okay. Wow, no questions. We're actually gonna finish this one in under an hour. Yeah, I'm trying on these, I know in person I often go like an hour and 15 minutes. I'm trying to keep these really under an hour because I think, at least for me, that's about as long as I can do the online video as a participant. So I'm trying to keep it that way. So what I'm going to do now is stop recording. So thanks for those of you watching the recording, tuning in, and we'll stop